Welcome to the Humanitarian Supply Chain Podcast, the first and only show that actually compares humanitarian aid and private sector supply chains using real cases, real field experience, and the kind of stories you'll never hear in a boardroom. If you are here for honest insights, field stories, and a few laughs at the beautiful mess we call supply chain, hit subscribe, keep listening, and leave a comment. Let's get started. Here is something we don't talk about enough. When disaster hits, the first signs aren't always dramatic. They're practical. A road that people rely on every day suddenly isn't usable. A shop that's normally stocked is empty because the supply truck couldn't get through. Fuel starts running low, and families who were stable just days early find themselves facing decisions no one prepares for: how to get food, how to stay warm, how to keep life moving when the basics stop working. When that happens, humanitarian teams step in quickly. The intention is always good. The instinct has always been the same: bring things in, move supplies, distribute as fast as possible. For a long time, that felt like the obvious solution, right? But with the time and experience, we've learned something important. That approach doesn't always support recovery. In some situations, it unintentionally makes things harder because every item we hand out connects to a local system that already exists. Traders, transporters, shop owners, farmers, the whole network that keeps a community functioning. And when we overlook that system or assume it's completely gone, we risk weakening the very foundation people need to rebuild their lives. This is where Emma comes in, the Emergency Market Mapping and Analysis Toolkit. It's a straightforward, practical way for humanitarian teams to understand how local markets are coping under the pressure of a crisis. So, our decisions actually help people instead of unintentionally making things harder. Emma isn't built for economists sitting behind spreadsheets. It's built for frontline staff, people who may not be market specialists, who may not have formal economic trainings, but who still need to make fast, informed choices in those early weeks when every decision matters. And here is what makes Emma so valuable: it doesn't promise perfect answers, it gives good enough answers, quick insights that help us avoid the classic mistakes we've seen in humanitarian response. Mistakes like flooding a market with free goods and wiping out local traders. Mistakes like assuming markets are dead when they're actually struggling but still functioning. Mistakes like overlooking gender and power dynamics that shape who can access what and under what conditions. Emma isn't for the chaotic first days of a disaster when no one even knows which roads are still usable. It's for the moments right after, when things settle just enough for us to ask the deeper questions. What do people need? How do they normally get the stuff, what's changed, and what's the smartest way to support recovery without creating new problems. To really understand why Emma matters, it helps to look at how it works. At its core, Emma has three simple strands: understanding what people need, understanding how the market is functioning, and figuring out the smartest response options. It walks team through 10 practical steps, from choosing which market to focus on to doing quick field works, mapping how goods move, analyzing what's changed, and sharing clear findings. The goal isn't to produce a perfect report, the goal is speed, clarity, and usable insights. Emma uses tools that make sense on the ground. Seasonal calendars that show when key products are normally available. Income and expenditure profiles that reveal how households actually manage money. And market system maps that show how goods move from producer to consumer, both before the crisis and after it hits. But Emma is more than a checklist. It's a way of looking at crisis. It reminds us that availability isn't the same as excess, and excess isn't the same as affordability. It pushes us to see that aid can strengthen market or weaken them. And the difference comes down to the choices we make. And to show what this looks like in practice, we are going to walk through real examples, moments where Emma didn't change the world with dramatic interventions, but with thoughtful, market aware decisions that protected livelihoods, respected dignity, and helped communities recover faster. In Haiti, after the floods, one issue rose to the surface very quickly. Beans, a staple food, a daily essential, had suddenly become hard to find. Not because the country ran out of beans, but because the roads that connected farmers, traders, and families were washed away. Communities were cut off, markets couldn't function, and humanitarian agencies faced a familiar crossroads. Do we import food or do we work with the systems that already exist? This is where Emma made a difference. When teams mapped the bean market system, they uncovered something important. The crisis had disrupted supply chain, yes. Transport was slow and uneven, but the market itself wasn't dead. Traders were still active, wholesalers still had stock, farmers in less affected areas were still harvesting. Transporters were finding alternative routes even if they were longer and more expensive. The system was under pressure, but it was still functioning. And real issue wasn't production or availability, it was excess. Families couldn't reach the beans, and the beans couldn't reach the families. That distinctions, availability versus excess, became the key to designing a smarter response. At first, many agencies planned to import beans. It felt like the quickest fix. But Emma showed the risk. Imported food would undercut local traders, push down prices for Haitian farmers, flood markets with free goods, and weaken the very system people rely on to recover. So the strategy shifted. In some areas, cash transfers became the main tool. Cash allowed families to buy beans locally, support traders, restore demand, and make choices that fit their needs. Cash wasn't just assistance, it was a way to keep the market alive. In other areas, agencies bought beans directly from Haitian traders and wholesalers. Local procurement kept business running, kept supply chain moving, and ensured traders could restock. Aid wasn't just about food, it was about protecting livelihoods. And from a logistics perspective, this shift was transformative. Importing beans would have meant international procurement, shipping, customs, warehousing, and distribution through damaged infrastructure, all slow, costly, and resource intensive. Cash and local procurement avoided those bottlenecks. They used the networks that already existed. Traders knew the terrain. They had relationships with farmers. They could move goods even in difficult conditions. Humanitarian agencies simply need to back them. In Myanmar, after the floods, many communities along the rivers and coastlines faced a sudden halt to their way of life. Fishing isn't just income there, it's identity, routine, and survival. When the floods swept through, families lost boats, nets, engines, and the basic tools they depend on. The immediate humanitarian instinct was understandable. People lost equipment, so let's replace it. But Emma pushed responders to ask a different question. How do local markets normally provide this equipment? And how can we support those systems instead of overriding them? When teams mapped the fishing equipment market, they found something important. Even after the floods, local rental markets were still operating. Rental providers were active, traders were open, nets, engines, and gear were available. The supply chain was stressed, but it hadn't collapsed. And this mattered because long before the floods, many fisher folks didn't own their equipment, they rented it. These rental systems were built on trust, relationship, and community networks. And even in crisis, they were still functioning. The real issue wasn't availability, it was affordability and access. Families had lost income. They couldn't afford to rent equipment. They couldn't restart their livelihoods. Not because the tools were gone, but because they were out of reach. That distinction, availability versus affordability, shaped the response. Direct donations of equipment would have undercut rental business, weakened traders, flooded the market with free goods, and disrupted a system that communities relied on long before the disaster. So agencies shifted their approach. Instead of distributing equipment, they supported the business that already provided it. Families received cash transfer and vouchers to rent what they needed. This restored purchasing power, kept rental providers afloat, strengthened local networks, and ensured equipment would remain available long after humanitarian teams left. And from a logistics perspective, this shift made a huge difference. Donating machinery would have required international procurement, shipping, customs, transport, through also maybe damaged goods, yeah, storage, distribution, and maintenance, all slow, costly, and resource intensive. Supporting local rental markets avoided those bottlenecks. It reduced transport needs, eliminating warehousing, bypassed customs delays, used existing distribution channels, and allowed families to access equipment immediately. Local providers already knew the terrain. They already had relationship with suppliers. They already had ways to move goods, even again in difficult conditions. Humanitarian agencies simply needed to reinforce what was already working. What Emma reveals again and again is that markets are far more resilient, adaptive, and capable of self correction than we give them credit for, and that the people who participate in those markets, like traders, transporters, wholesalers, shopkeepers, farmers, and small business owners, are often the first to rebuild long before humanitarian agencies arrive with trucks and tarpaulins. Although Emma was designed for humanitarian emergencies, its underlying logic resonates deeply with the private sector, even if companies really use the same vocabulary. In fact, many of the world's most successful corporations rely on tools and approaches that mirror Emma's principles. Because whether you are responding to a flood in Pakistan or supply chain disruptions in China, the fundamental challenge is the same. You must understand the system, anticipate shocks, and protect the actors within it. Companies like Toyota, for example, have built entire philosophies around supply chain mapping, redundancy planning, and risk mitigation. Their approach to just in time production is often understood as fragile system, but in reality it is supported by deep continuous analysis of supply networks, transport routes, inventory buffers, and contingency plans, all of which echo Emma emphasis on understanding how goods move from producers to consumers and where the system is most vulnerable. Apple, one of the most complex supply chain operators in the world, uses tools that resemble Emma's market system maps to trace the flow of materials from mines to smelter to component manufacturers to assembly plants. Their risk analysis frameworks identify bottlenecks, geopolitical vulnerabilities, and potential disruptions long before they occur. Their scenario planning exercises mirror EMA's rapid assessment approach, allowing them to pivot quickly when a supplier fails, a port closes, or a natural disaster strikes. Retailers like Walmart rely on real time procurement systems, early warning dashboards, and predictive analytics to monitor inventory levels, transport delays, and market shocks. These tools serve the same purpose as Emma's seasonal calendars and household expenditure profiles. They help decision makers understand what people need, how they normally get it, and how disruptions affect access. Starbucks applies ethical sourcing frameworks that resemble EMA focus on protecting local livelihoods. Their coffee and pharma equity practices program maps the entire coffee supply chain, identifies vulnerabilities, and invests in pharma resilience. A private sector parallel to EMA's emphasis on supporting market actors rather than replacing them. Even companies outside traditional supply chains, like financial institutions, tech firms, and logistic providers, use ML-like approaches. They conduct stress tests, build resilience frameworks, run simulations, and map dependencies across their networks. They understand that systems are interconnected, that shocks ripple outward, and that protecting the system requires understanding it deeply. What this means for non supply chain professionals is simple but profound. EMMA is not just a humanitarian tool, it is a way of thinking about systems, resilience, and recovery that applies across sectors. Whether you are responding to a flood, managing a global supply chain, or running a small business, the principles are the same. Understand how the system works, identify where it is vulnerable, and design interventions that strengthen rather than weaken it. As we reach the end of this episode, it is worth stepping back and reflecting on what Emma truly represents, not just for humanitarian responders, but for anyone who cares about how communities survive, adapt, and rebuild in the face of crisis. Emma is not simply a toolkit. It is not a checklist, a methodology, or set of forms to be filled out. It is a mindset, a way of seeing markets not as fragile structures waiting to collapse, but as resilient, adaptive systems that continue to function even under extraordinary pressure. And that mindset matters because when we understand markets as living systems, we stop designing responses for people and start designing responses with them. We stop assuming what is broken and start discovering what is working. We stop rushing to replace local systems and instead learn how to strengthen them. Emma reminds us that even in the most difficult moments, people are not passive recipients of aid, they are active participants in their own recovery. So, whether you are a seasoned humanitarian, a student exploring this field, or a supply chain professional curious about how your skills translate into crisis response, I hope Emma gives you a new lens, one that is practical, respectful, and deeply human. Thank you for joining me on the Humanitarian Supply Chain podcast. I'm Irina Lukyanova, and I hope you found this exploration of Emma insightful and thought provoking. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend. And if you have questions, reflections, or ideas for future topics, reach out on social media or send me an email. I would truly love to hear from you. I'll leave the Emma Toolkit in the description. Please don't hesitate to click, explore, and use it in your supply chain work. It's a resource designed to empower you and ultimately to empower the communities we serve in. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep the supply chain moving.